The soft chime of the cafe doorbell barely cut through the chaos in Ethan Ross's mind as he stepped inside. It was a rare moment of anonymity for the millionaire, who typically spent his days in luxury high-rises and chauffeured cars. But today, something had drawn him to this small, unassuming cafe tucked away on a quiet street. His expensive suit seemed out of place among the rustic wooden tables and mismatched chairs, yet he didn't care. He wasn't here to be seen. Ethan's mind was restless, consumed by a memory he couldn't shake. Today marked the 15th anniversary of his sister Lily's disappearance. The pain of her absence, dulled by time, had returned with full force. There was no closure, no trace of her after she vanished. All he had was a single photograph of the two of them, taken just days before she disappeared, and the aching void that grew wider with each passing year. As he sat at the corner table, he let his gaze drift around the room, lost in thought. Then, a faint sound of footsteps brought him back to the present. A waitress approached, holding a notepad and wearing a bright smile. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair pulled into a ponytail and an air of casual ease. "Can I get you something, sir?" she asked politely. Ethan barely registered her words at first, but as she moved closer, something caught his eye. Dangling from her wrist was a simple silver bracelet, worn with age but unmistakable in its design. His breath caught in his throat. It was a bracelet he knew intimately. He had given one just like it to Lily on her 16th birthday. He had designed it himself, its intricate pattern unique to her. Time seemed to slow as he stared at the bracelet, disbelief washing over him. How could this be? After all these years, how could a random waitress in a small cafe be wearing something that belonged to his missing sister? His voice faltered when he finally spoke. "That bracelet, where did you get it?" The waitress, confused by the intensity in his voice, looked down at her wrist, then back at him. "Oh, it's just an old family heirloom," she said casually, her smile faltering slightly under his scrutiny. "My grandmother passed it down to me." Ethan's chest tightened. An heirloom? His mind raced with possibilities. Was this some sort of mistake? A coincidence? Or was this the break he had been waiting for? The thread that could unravel the mystery of his sister's disappearance? He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the bracelet. "You're sure about that? It came from your grandmother?" His voice was low but urgent now. The waitress blinked, clearly caught off guard by his intensity. "Yes, she gave it to me before she passed away," she said, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face. "Why are you asking?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of hope and fear rising inside him. There had to be more to this story. He had spent years chasing dead ends, false leads, and unsubstantiated rumors about his sister's fate. But now, sitting across from this unassuming waitress with his sister's bracelet around her wrist, he felt closer to the truth than ever before. He stood abruptly, startling the waitress. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "About that bracelet. About your family. Please, it's important." The waitress took a step back, her brows furrowed in confusion. I don't understand. It's just a bracelet. What does it have to do with anything?" Ethan clenched his fists, struggling to keep his composure. He couldn't reveal too much, not yet, but he knew he couldn't walk away, not without answers, not without understanding how she had come into possession of something that should have been with his sister all these years. "Please," he said again, his voice softer this time, "I need to know where your grandmother got that bracelet." The waitress hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if searching for an escape. Then, with a sigh, she nodded reluctantly. "All right," she said, "but I don't know how much help I'll be. My grandmother didn't talk much about the past." Ethan exhaled, relief and tension swirling inside him. He wasn't sure what he would find, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," he said, his voice steadier now. "You have no idea how important this could be." As the waitress led him to a quieter corner of the cafe, Ethan's mind was already racing ahead. Whoever this woman was, she held the key to unlocking a mystery that had haunted him for 15 years. And he wouldn't stop until he found out the truth. Ethan could feel his pulse in his ears as he followed the waitress to a quiet corner of the cafe, away from the hum of customers. His eyes never left the bracelet, the object of his obsession. He had spent years imagining what had happened to Lily, where she might have gone, why she had disappeared. Every theory, every suspicion he had once held seemed to swirl around that delicate silver chain. The waitress, Grace, as she had introduced herself, sat down across from him, clearly uncomfortable under his intense gaze. She fidgeted with her apron, then glanced at the bracelet on her wrist, which now seemed to burn in the air between them. "So," she began, her voice uncertain, "you wanted to know more about this?" She lifted her wrist slightly, as if to emphasize the bracelet. Ethan nodded, swallowing hard to suppress the rising tide of emotions within him. "Yes," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I gave that bracelet to my sister, Lily, 15 years ago, before she disappeared." Grace's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, her confusion seemed genuine. "Disappeared?" she echoed. "I don't understand. How could this bracelet be connected to her?" "That's what I need to find out," Ethan said, leaning forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "You said it was passed down from your grandmother. Do you know where your grandmother got it? Anything at all?" Grace's brow furrowed as she thought, clearly thrown by Ethan's revelation. I don't know much," she admitted, shaking her head. "My grandmother was always kind of secretive about her past. She gave me this bracelet a few years before she died, but she never really talked about where it came from. She just said it was something precious." "Something precious," Ethan repeated, his mind racing. The last time he had seen Lily, she had been wearing that bracelet. It was the only piece of jewelry she truly cherished, handcrafted, one of a kind. There was no way it could be a coincidence. Grace's grandmother had to be connected somehow, but the question was how. He studied Grace's face, searching for any clue in her expression, but all he saw was uncertainty. "Do you have any old photographs of your grandmother? Anything that might give me a clue about where she lived or who she knew?" Grace looked visibly uneasy now, glancing around the cafe as if looking for an escape. "I mean, maybe," she said hesitantly, "but I don't understand why this is so important to you. You're saying your sister vanished and somehow my grandmother has something to do with it? I don't know. It seems impossible." Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair, his frustration mounting. He had been chasing ghosts for so long that every dead end felt like a punch to the gut. But this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. He had to press on, even if it meant forcing Grace to confront something she wasn't ready to. "I understand it sounds crazy," Ethan said, his tone softening, "but Lily was my sister. She was everything to me, and when she disappeared, a part of me disappeared too. For years, I've tried to figure out what happened to her. Every lead, every clue. It all leads to nothing. But now, here I am, looking at the bracelet I gave her, on your wrist. Don't you see? I have to know if this means something. If your family is somehow connected to my sister's disappearance." Grace looked down at the table, her fingers nervously toying with the edge of her apron. "I get that you're looking for answers," she said softly, "but all I know is what my grandmother told me. She gave me the bracelet, said it was special, but she didn't say where she got it. And now she's gone, so I can't exactly ask her." The frustration in Ethan's chest tightened. It was another dead end, or so it seemed, but he wasn't ready to give up. "Was there anything strange about your grandmother's past? Anything she tried to hide?" Grace hesitated, biting her lip as she seemed to weigh her words. "I guess there were some things she didn't like to talk about," she admitted. "She worked as a housekeeper for a wealthy family a long time ago. That's all I know. She never told me their name, but she mentioned it a few times when I was a kid. She said it was hard work, but they paid well." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. A wealthy family. Could Grace's grandmother have worked for his family without anyone realizing the connection? He had to find out more. "I need to know the name of that family," Ethan said urgently. "If she worked for my family, this might explain how she got the bracelet. It's a start." Grace looked reluctant. "I don't know the name," she said honestly, "but maybe I could look through some of her old things. She kept a lot of letters and documents in a box after she moved in with my mom." Ethan felt a spark of hope. "Would you do that? Please. If there's any clue, anything at all, It could help me find out what happened to Lily. Grace nodded slowly, though she still seemed unsure. I'll look, she said, standing up from the table, but I can't promise I'll find anything. Ethan stood as well, grateful but still on edge. That's all I ask, he said, offering a tense smile. Thank you, Grace. You have no idea how much this means to me. Grace gave him a small nod before heading back to the counter. As Ethan watched her go, the weight of everything pressed down on him. He had finally found a thread to pull, one that could unravel the mystery that had haunted him for so long. But as he left the cafe, a new thought gnawed at him. If Grace's family was connected to his sister's disappearance, what other secrets would they uncover? And would he be ready to face them when they did? Ethan paced the floor of his penthouse, staring out at the sprawling city skyline, his mind consumed by the meeting with Grace. The image of her wearing that bracelet lingered like an imprint on his soul. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of something monumental. Yet, for all the hope it brought, it also filled him with dread. If Grace's grandmother had truly been connected to his family, then the secrets his parents had buried might finally come to light. Secrets that could shatter the already fragile foundation of his life. His phone vibrated on the table, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. It was a message from his private investigator, Claire Jacobs, whom he had contacted the moment he left the cafe. Got the info you requested. Grace Adams, 24. No criminal record. Waitress at the cafe for 3 years. Grandmother's name, Helen Adams, deceased 5 years ago. Housekeeper for an unnamed wealthy family for over 20 years. Ethan read the message over and over, his heart racing as a familiar sense of anticipation settled in. Helen Adams, her name meant nothing to him, but the detail about her being a housekeeper confirmed Grace's story. He immediately dialed Claire's number, needing more. Ethan, Claire's voice came through after the second ring. I figured you'd want an update. I do, Ethan said, his voice sharp with urgency. What else do you know about Helen Adams? Did she work for my family? Claire paused before answering, as though considering how much to reveal. There's no direct link yet, but I've been digging into old employment records. If she worked for your family under a different name or through an agency, it might take time to track. But I did find something that might interest you. What is it? Ethan asked, his pulse quickening. According to what I've found, Helen Adams lived in a small house on the outskirts of the city for most of her life. After she retired, she moved in with her daughter, Grace's mother. However, during her time as a housekeeper, she was involved in a scandal, a rather serious one. Ethan stiffened, his grip tightening around the phone. A scandal? Yes. I couldn't get all the details, but there were rumors of an affair with her employer. It never made it to the public eye, but there's talk of hush money, attempts to bury the story. No one ever identified the employer publicly, but considering the circles your family moves in, it's possible Helen worked for someone in your network. Ethan's stomach churned. The thought of his father, or someone else close to him, being involved in such a scandal felt like another crack forming in the already fragile shell of his family. His father had always been the epitome of control, someone who ruled his business empire with an iron fist. But beneath that polished exterior, Ethan had long suspected there were darker currents, secrets no one dared speak of. Find out who it was, Ethan said through gritted teeth. I don't care how long it takes. Track down anyone who worked with her, any old records. I need to know if this connects to my family. I'm on it, Claire promised. But Ethan, you should be careful. If this ties back to your family, it could open up a lot of old wounds. And not just for you. I'm prepared for whatever it brings, Ethan said, though he wasn't sure if that was entirely true. Just find the answers. He hung up the phone, his mind spinning. He had always sensed there was something lurking beneath the surface of his family's polished image, something ugly and corrosive. His father's tight-lipped approach to business and family affairs had made it clear that some things were better left unsaid. But now, those hidden truths were slipping through the cracks, threatening to reveal themselves whether anyone was ready for them or not. That evening, Ethan found himself sitting at his grand mahogany desk, sifting through old photo albums, memories of his sister flooding back with painful clarity. Pictures of them as children, Lily smiling in the backyard, her arms wrapped around their family dog. the two of them playing in the garden, carefree, before the weight of life's complications bore down on them. Lily had always been the light of their family. Kind-hearted, creative, always the one who could make everyone laugh, even when things seemed dark. Losing her had been like losing the sun. His family had never been the same. His parents had buried their grief in silence, refusing to speak of her disappearance, as though pretending it hadn't happened could erase the pain. Now, sitting there with the memories of his lost sister, Ethan felt closer to understanding what had happened to her than he ever had before. But with that closeness came a creeping fear. What if the truth wasn't something he wanted to know? What if Lily's disappearance had been orchestrated by someone in his family? Someone who would stop at nothing to keep it buried? 2 days later, Ethan received a call from Grace. "Hey, it's me," she said, her voice quiet. I looked through my grandmother's things like you asked. There's a box full of old letters and photographs. I didn't go through all of them, but I found something that might interest you." Ethan's heart leaped into his throat. "What did you find?" "There's a letter. I didn't understand all of it, but it's addressed to my grandmother from someone named R. It talks about an arrangement, something about keeping things quiet. I thought it might be important. Do you still have it?" Ethan asked, trying to control the tremor in his voice. "Yeah, I do," Grace replied. "I can bring it to you if you want." "Please," Ethan said quickly. "I'll come to the cafe." When he arrived later that afternoon, Grace was waiting for him, the box of her grandmother's things sitting on the table in front of her. Ethan couldn't help but notice the nervous energy radiating from her as she pushed the letter across the table. Ethan opened the envelope carefully, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, as though the writer had been conscious of every word they chose. "Helen, as we discussed, it's important that we keep our arrangement confidential. No one can know the truth, for both our sakes. Enclosed is the remainder of the payment I promised. I trust you understand the need for discretion, especially considering the circumstances. Should any problems arise, contact me immediately. You know how to reach me. R." Ethan stared at the letter, his mind reeling. It didn't directly mention the bracelet or his family, but the tone of secrecy was unmistakable. Whoever this R was, they had gone to great lengths to keep something hidden. Could this be the key to what happened to Lily? Was Helen Adams involved in something far more sinister than he had imagined? Grace watched him closely, her own unease evident. "What does it mean?" she asked quietly. "I don't know yet," Ethan said, though his gut told him it was the beginning of something much darker than he had anticipated. "But we're going to find out." Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, the letter from Grace's grandmother spread out on the coffee table in front of him. The dim city lights flickered outside, casting long shadows across the room. He had read the letter a dozen times, but each time it left him with more questions than answers. Who was R? What arrangement had been made with Helen Adams? And, most importantly, how did it all tie into Lily's disappearance? His thoughts drifted to his father, Richard Ross, a man known for his ironclad control over both his family and his business empire. Growing up, Ethan had always looked up to his father, admiring his strength and determination. But over the years, he had begun to see the cracks in that image. Richard had always been secretive, dismissive when it came to personal matters, especially those involving Lily. After she disappeared, he had insisted they move on, that dwelling on the past wouldn't bring her back. But Ethan had never been able to forget. And now, after finding this letter, the unsettling possibility that his father had something to do with it was gnawing at him. The thought that Richard might be R filled him with dread, but it was a possibility he couldn't ignore. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He needed to confront his parents, but he knew his father wouldn't make it easy. His mother, Margaret, had always been the more sensitive and emotional of the two. Maybe she would be more willing to talk, more open to revealing what had been buried for so long. He arrived at the family estate late in the afternoon, the grand mansion looming before him like a relic from another era. It was a place that had once felt like home, but now it felt more like a mausoleum, a reminder of everything that had been lost. Margaret greeted him at the door, her warm smile fading as soon as she saw the tension in his face. "Ethan, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft and concerned. "I need to talk to you," Ethan said, stepping inside. "It's about Lily." His mother's face paled, and for a moment, she looked as though she might refuse. But after a brief hesitation, she nodded. "Come with me." They walked through the house in silence, the familiar scent of polished wood and old books filling the air. Margaret led him to the sitting room, where they sat in front of a large bay window overlooking the garden. Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her expression pained. "I didn't think we'd ever talk about Lily again," she said quietly. "Your father, he never wanted to." Ethan leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Mom, I need to know the truth. I found something. A letter from Grace's grandmother, Helen Adams. She worked for a wealthy family, and there's a chance it could have been ours. There's mention of a deal she made with someone named R. Was Helen connected to us? Was Dad involved in something? Something you've kept from me?" His mother flinched at the mention of the letter, her hands trembling. "Helen, yes, she worked for us," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was our housekeeper for years, but that was a long time ago, Ethan." Ethan felt a surge of anger. "And you never thought to tell me? Not once? I've been searching for answers about Lily for 15 years, and you didn't think I deserved to know this?" Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, and she looked away, ashamed. "Your father made it clear we weren't to speak of it. After what happened, he said it was for the best to leave the past behind. He didn't want to open old wounds." "Open old wounds?" Ethan's voice rose, incredulous. "Lily disappeared, Mom. She vanished without a trace, and you just let Dad sweep it under the rug?" "I didn't want to," Margaret said, her voice breaking, "but you don't understand what it was like. Your father, he was so certain that there was nothing more to be done. He hired investigators, but when nothing came of it, he said we had to move on. He didn't want the scandal, the attention. And Helen, she left soon after Lily disappeared." Ethan's mind raced. Why? Why did she leave? Margaret looked at him with sorrowful eyes, her words dripping with regret. "I don't know. She said it was because of her health, but there was always something off about her after Lily went missing. She became distant, more secretive. Your father handled it. He gave her severance and told her she could go. I never questioned it. I didn't know. I didn't want to know." Ethan's hands clenched into fists, a cold anger simmering inside him. His father had buried this, just as he had suspected. And this are in the letter. Could that be Dad? Margaret's face fell even further at the mention of R, and the way her gaze flickered away told Ethan all he needed to know. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But if it is, Ethan, I don't think you're prepared for what you might find." The words hung heavy in the air, and Ethan felt his heart sink. His father had always been a man of power and influence, but the idea that he could be involved in something that led to Lily's disappearance, something so dark that it had to be kept secret for years, was a possibility Ethan had tried to avoid. But now, it seemed unavoidable. Later that evening, as the sun set over the sprawling estate, Ethan found himself in his father's study. Richard Ross sat behind his enormous oak desk, reviewing documents with his usual air of authority. His presence was commanding, as always, but today, Ethan felt nothing but contempt. "Dad, we need to talk," Ethan said, his voice steely as he entered the room. Richard looked up, his sharp blue eyes narrowing in curiosity. "About what?" "About Lily," Ethan said, watching for any flicker of emotion, "and about Helen Adams." For a moment, Richard's expression remained neutral, but then something cold passed over his face, an unmistakable hardening of his features. "That's in the past, Ethan. We agreed to let it go." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I didn't agree to anything. I found a letter, Dad, from Helen. There's mention of some kind of arrangement with someone named R. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Richard's eyes darkened, and he slowly stood up, his posture rigid. "I don't know where you're getting these ideas, but I suggest you stop digging." "I'm not going to stop," Ethan said, stepping forward, refusing to be intimidated. "Not until I know the truth about what happened to Lily. You've been hiding something, and I'm done pretending it doesn't matter." Richard's expression turned icy, his voice lowering to a dangerous tone. You don't know what you're talking about, Ethan. You're digging into matters that don't concern you. They do concern me, Ethan shot back, his voice rising. Lily was my sister, and you've done everything you can to erase her from our lives. Why, Dad? What are you so afraid of? Richard's silence was damning. For the first time, Ethan saw the flicker of guilt in his father's eyes. Just for a moment, but it was there. I've always done what was necessary to protect this family, Richard said, his voice cold but laced with an unspoken weight. I suggest you remember that before you go any further. Ethan stared at his father, his heart pounding with rage and confusion. The walls of their family's secrets were starting to crack, but he had a sinking feeling that the truth would be far darker than he could ever have imagined. Ethan stormed out of his father's study, fury bubbling under his skin. Richard's cold words echoed in his mind. I've always done what was necessary to protect this family. But the more Ethan thought about it, the more it sickened him. What had his father done in the name of protection? And who had paid the price for his secrets? As he left the estate, Ethan's hands trembled with a mix of frustration and dread. He had spent years trying to understand why Lily had disappeared, and now it felt like the answers were just out of reach, obscured by his father's ironclad grip on the past. But one thing was clear. Richard was hiding something ugly, and Ethan was going to tear it down, no matter what it cost. Back in his penthouse, Ethan poured himself a stiff drink and dialed Claire's number. He needed her to keep digging, even if it meant uncovering things that could destroy his family's reputation. Claire, I need you to push harder on the investigation, he said when she picked up. My father's involved in this. I can feel it. There was a pause on the other end. Are you sure you want to go down this road? Claire asked carefully. Once we start pulling at these threads, there's no going back. I'm sure, Ethan said firmly. If my father had anything to do with Lily's disappearance, I need to know. And I need to know who our is. All right, Claire said, her tone professional. I'll dig into your father's records. If there's a link between him and Helen Adams, I'll find it. Days passed, and Ethan's patience wore thin. The more he reflected on his father's cryptic warnings, the angrier he became. His mother's broken confession about Helen, his father's refusal to answer, the letter, all pointed to something much deeper than a family squabble. Ethan knew his father was a man who valued control above all else. But how far had Richard gone to keep control? And had Lily been a casualty of his obsession? The more Ethan thought about it, the more certain he became. His father had betrayed him, had betrayed Lily, and now there was no choice but to expose the truth. Then, late one evening, Claire called him back. Her voice was steady, but Ethan could hear the tension beneath it. I found something, she said, cutting straight to the point. What is it? Ethan asked, his pulse quickening. I've been going through old employment records from when Helen Adams worked for your family. It was difficult, but I managed to track down a few old staff members who remembered her. One of them, an ex-butler named James, mentioned something interesting. Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. Go on. James said that around the time your sister disappeared, Helen became deeply distraught. She confided in him once, saying that she had done something she regretted, something that had to be kept secret. He didn't know what she meant at the time, but when I showed him the letter you found, he recognized the handwriting. Ethan's throat tightened. What did he say? James confirmed that the letter was written by your father, Claire said quietly. He's our dot. The air was sucked from Ethan's lungs. For a moment, the world felt like it was spinning. He had suspected it, feared it, but to hear it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. My father, Ethan whispered, the words catching in his throat. Yes, Claire continued. It appears that Helen was involved in some kind of arrangement with your father. I'm still piecing together the details, but it seems like he was paying her off to keep quiet about something. James also mentioned that after Lily disappeared, your father became more withdrawn, more secretive. There were rumors within the household that he was involved in some scandal, but no one dared confront him. Ethan's mind raced, every word from Claire like a knife twisting deeper into his heart. His father, his own father, had been hiding the truth all along, and Helen Adams had been paid to keep her mouth shut. Do you think Helen had something to do with Lily's disappearance? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know for sure, Claire replied. But whatever happened, it was enough to make Helen leave. And your father's payments to her stopped shortly after she retired. Ethan's grip tightened around the phone. The implications were staggering. If Richard had been paying Helen to keep quiet, then it stood to reason that Helen knew what had happened to Lily. But with Helen dead, the trail seemed to grow cold. There's something else, Claire said hesitantly. Ethan's pulse quickened. What? I found another letter, she continued. It was in Helen's personal effects, among the documents Grace gave you. It's much older than the first one, dated just a few weeks after Lily disappeared. This letter wasn't from your father. It was from Helen to someone named S. Ethan's brow furrowed. S? Who is that? I don't know, Claire admitted, but the letter is vague. Helen was worried about something, about the girl, and she asked this S to help her make sure no one found out. It seems like she was terrified, Ethan. Whatever she and your father were involved in, it went deeper than just a payout. I think this might know more. Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind spinning with possibilities. A second player, someone Helen had turned to for help. But who? And why? Send me a copy of the letter, Ethan said, his voice firm. I need to see it for myself. I'll get it to you, Claire promised. But Ethan, you need to be careful. If your father's involved in something this big, and there's another person who knows about it, things could get dangerous. I'm not backing down, Ethan said, his voice hardening. I'll find out what happened to Lily, no matter what it takes. The next morning, the letter from Helen to S arrived in Ethan's email inbox. He opened the file, his eyes scanning the old, yellowed paper. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in fear. The contents were brief, but chilling. I can't keep this secret any longer. The girl. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I need your help. If they find out, everything will fall apart. We have to make sure no one knows, or can't find out what we did. Helen. Ethan's blood ran cold. The letter didn't give specifics, but the implication was clear. Whatever had happened to Lily had been a mistake. And now, Helen and this mysterious had covered it up, terrified that the truth would come out. His thoughts raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. Who was S? What had Helen and this person done that they were so desperate to keep hidden? And, more importantly, had Lily's disappearance been an accident, or something far worse? Ethan knew he had to find S, the only person left who might hold the final piece to the mystery. But as he prepared to confront his father once more, a creeping sense of dread filled him. If Richard had known about this all along, what else was he capable of? And just how far would he go to keep Ethan from uncovering the truth? The weight of Helen's letter to S sat heavily on Ethan's mind as he sat by the window, staring out at the city below. The revelation that his father had not only been involved, but had potentially orchestrated a cover-up of Lily's disappearance was almost too much to bear. But it was the mention of the girl that gnawed at him the most. Was Helen referring to Lily? And if so, what had she and this mysterious S done to her? Ethan's phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Grace. I found something else. It's about my family. Can we meet? His heart skipped a beat. Whatever Grace had discovered, it felt like another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Ethan quickly texted back and arranged to meet her at the cafe that evening. When he arrived at the cafe, Grace was already waiting for him, seated at the same table where they had first talked about the bracelet. She looked anxious, her fingers nervously tapping on the edge of her cup. When Ethan sat down across from her, he noticed a stack of old photographs and letters on the table in front of her. I've been going through more of my grandmother's things, Grace said, her voice tense. And I found something I think you need to see. She slid a small, faded photograph across the table. Ethan picked it up, his breath catching in his throat. It was a picture of two young girls, maybe in their early teens. One of them was unmistakably Lily, her bright smile, her carefree posture. But the other girl... Ethan's hand trembled as he realized what he was seeing. The other girl in the photo looked exactly like Grace. That's impossible, Ethan whispered, staring at the photograph. How can this be? Grace bit her lip, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "I don't know," she said softly. "I've never seen this picture before. My grandmother never mentioned it. But there's more." She handed Ethan a letter, yellowed with age, written in the same shaky handwriting as the other letters from Helen. He unfolded it carefully, his heart pounding in his chest as he began to read. "Helen, I've taken care of everything, but we need to be more careful. The girls, they're too close. We can't let anyone know the truth. If her finds out, it'll ruin everything. I'll make sure they're separated, but you need to keep the girl quiet. No one can know what really happened that night." Ethan's mind raced, struggling to make sense of the words. The girls. Could Helen and this have been talking about Lily and Grace? But how could Grace be involved? She had no memory of any of this, no connection to his family, at least, none that she knew of. "I don't understand," Grace said, her voice trembling. "Why would my grandmother have a picture of me and your sister? I don't remember any of this. I never even met your family, did I?" Ethan stared at her, his mind spinning. "You said your grandmother was secretive about her past," he said, his voice low. "Is it possible she was hiding something bigger than we thought? What if you and Lily, what if you were connected in a way neither of us realized?" Grace shook her head, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I don't know. I don't remember any of this. But that letter, it sounds like they were trying to separate us. Why?" Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the letter from Helen. "It says here that they needed to keep you quiet, that no one could know what really happened that night. Grace, do you remember anything strange from when you were a kid? Anything at all?" Grace closed her eyes, trying to focus, but after a few moments, she shook her head again. "No, nothing. My childhood was normal, or at least I thought it was. But now, I'm starting to wonder if there were things my grandmother hid from me. She always acted like she was protecting me, but I never questioned it." Ethan leaned forward, his voice filled with urgency. "What if she wasn't just protecting you from the past, but from who you really are?" Grace's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated, the weight of his suspicions growing heavier with each passing second. "Grace, what if you're not who you think you are? What if you and Lily were closer than we realized? What if you were sisters?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible to grasp. Grace stared at him, her face pale, as though the idea had never even occurred to her. "Sisters?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know it sounds crazy," Ethan said, "but look at the photo. You're the same age as Lily. And the letters, they talk about keeping you two apart, about hiding something. If you were sisters, it would explain why Helen was so desperate to keep the truth hidden. It would explain why my father was involved. Maybe Lily's disappearance was part of a larger plan, something that was meant to keep the two of you from ever finding out the truth." Grace shook her head, her voice trembling. "No, that can't be. My mother would have told me. She would have said something." "Would she?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle but insistent. "Or would she have gone along with whatever your grandmother told her, thinking it was for the best? Grace, think about it. If your grandmother was trying to protect you from something, from someone, my father, maybe, wouldn't she have done everything in her power to keep the truth from you?" Grace covered her face with her hands, trying to process the flood of information. It was too much, too overwhelming. "But why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why would they keep us apart if we were sisters? What could have been so terrible that they had to lie to us our whole lives?" Ethan took a deep breath, his thoughts darkening. "I don't know yet, but I think it has something to do with my father. He's been hiding something, something big, and I think your grandmother was involved in it. If they were trying to keep you and Lily apart, there must have been a reason." Grace looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "What do we do now?" "We need to find out more about your grandmother's connection to my family," Ethan said, his voice firm. "And we need to find out who this is. They were a part of this, too. Maybe even more than my father. They know what happened to Lily. They know the truth." Grace nodded slowly, still shaken by the possibility that her entire life had been a lie. "But how do we find them?" "I'll talk to my father again," Ethan said, his jaw clenched. "If he's hiding something, I'll make him tell me. And Claire is still looking into old records. If there's anything that connects us to my family, we'll find it. Grace swallowed hard, her hands shaking. Ethan, if what you're saying is true, then I've lived my whole life not knowing who I really am. And Lily, if she was my sister, too, then I've lost her without ever knowing her. Ethan reached across the table and gently took her hand. We'll find out the truth, Grace. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. Grace squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. I hope you're right, she whispered, because if we're wrong, I don't know if I can handle what we'll find. The revelation that Grace could be Ethan's long-lost sister had turned their world upside down. After hours of poring over the letters, photographs, and memories, the two of them knew they were standing on the edge of something monumental. But as much as they wanted to uncover the truth, the danger they sensed lurking in the shadows grew more palpable with every new discovery. Ethan's decision was clear. He needed to confront his father again. Richard had dodged the questions before, but now Ethan had more evidence, more leverage. He wouldn't let his father slip away this time. But first, he needed to make sure Grace was safe. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was watching them, someone who knew far more about Lily's disappearance than they did. The mention of S in Helen's letters haunted him. Whoever S was, they had been involved in keeping Grace and Lily apart. And if they were still around, they would go to great lengths to keep the truth buried. It was late afternoon when Ethan received a text from Claire. Found a potential lead on S. Need to talk ASAP. His pulse quickened as he called her back immediately. Claire picked up after the first ring. Claire, what did you find? Ethan asked, his voice urgent. I've been going through some of the old estate records, Claire said. There were a few files that had been buried, but I managed to uncover some documents that mention a woman named Sylvia Monroe. She was a close associate of your father's around the time of Lily's disappearance, but her name was scrubbed from most official documents. Ethan's jaw tightened. Sylvia Monroe. Is she still around? From what I can tell, yes, Claire continued. She dropped off the radar for a while, but it looks like she resurfaced a few years ago. There's no direct connection between her and your father anymore, but she's still living in the city. I've got an address. Ethan's heart raced. Send it to me. I'll go see her. Ethan, wait, Claire said, her voice cautioning. If this woman is involved in whatever happened to Lily, and if she's been hiding it for this long, she could be dangerous. You need to be careful. Don't go there alone. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Claire was right. He didn't know what Sylvia might do if she felt threatened, but he couldn't sit by and wait any longer. I'll take Grace with me, Ethan said finally. She deserves to know the truth just as much as I do. All right, Claire said, though her tone remained wary. Just be careful, and keep me updated. After hanging up, Ethan texted Grace, asking her to meet him at his penthouse. There was no easy way to explain everything over the phone, and he needed her to hear it face to face. When Grace arrived, Ethan could see the tension in her eyes. The discoveries they had made in the past few days had taken a toll on both of them, but they were united in their need for answers. What's going on? Grace asked as she stepped into the living room, her arms folded protectively over her chest. I have a lead on S, Ethan said, watching her reaction carefully. Her name is Sylvia Monroe. She was close to my father when Lily disappeared, and it looks like she was involved in keeping the two of you apart. Grace's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. Do you think she knows what happened to Lily? I do, Ethan said, nodding. I'm going to confront her, but I need you to come with me. Grace hesitated, her brow furrowing in thought. Ethan, if she was involved in keeping us apart, she might not want to talk to us. She might lie, or worse. I know, Ethan said, his voice firm, but if she's the one who knows the truth, we need to hear it from her. And I want you to be there. This is your story as much as it is mine. Grace stared at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Okay, I'll go with you. Later that evening, Ethan and Grace found themselves driving through a quiet, upscale neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The address Claire had given them led to a secluded house, surrounded by tall hedges and iron gates. The house was large but understated, a far cry from the grandeur of the Ross estate, yet it exuded an air of quiet wealth. Ethan parked the car on the street, and they both sat in silence for a moment, staring at the house ahead. The gravity of what they were about to do weighed heavily on them both. "Are you sure about this?" Grace asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Ethan nodded, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "We need to know the truth." Taking a deep breath, they stepped out of the car and approached the gate. Ethan pressed the intercom button, and after a few moments, a woman's voice crackled through the speaker. "Who is it?" "Sylvia Monroe?" Ethan said, his voice steady. "My name is Ethan Ross. I need to speak with you. It's about Lily Ross." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Ethan thought Sylvia might refuse. But then the gate slowly creaked open, and a sense of foreboding settled over him as they walked up the driveway. When the door to the house opened, they were greeted by a woman in her late 50s, elegant but severe, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Sylvia Monroe's appearance was striking. Her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked at Ethan and Grace with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "You're Richard's son," she said, her voice smooth but cold. "I've been expecting you." Ethan exchanged a glance with Grace, his pulse quickening. "You knew I was coming?" "I knew someone would come eventually," Sylvia replied, stepping aside to let them in. "Your father may have hidden things for a long time, but secrets like these don't stay buried forever." They entered the house, which was sparsely decorated but filled with an air of quiet opulence. Sylvia led them into a sitting room, where she gestured for them to sit. "So," she said, folding her hands in her lap as she settled into a chair across from them, "what do you want to know?" Ethan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. "I want to know what happened to my sister. I want to know why you and my father kept it a secret for all these years. And I want to know how Grace fits into all of this." Sylvia's gaze shifted to Grace, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Grace, I always wondered if you would come looking for answers. I suppose I owe you both the truth, now that things are coming to light." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "Tell us. Everything." Sylvia sighed, her steely composure faltering for the first time. "Your father and I were involved in something complicated. It started years ago, long before Lily disappeared. There were things your father didn't want anyone to know about, affairs, illegitimate children, and business deals that would have destroyed his reputation. Helen Adams knew too much, and so did Lily. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and, well, we had to protect Richard's legacy." Ethan's stomach twisted. "What does this have to do with Grace?" Sylvia turned to Grace, her expression unreadable. "Because Grace is your sister. Your father had an affair with Helen, and Grace was the result. When Helen realized that the truth would destroy everything, she tried to run. But your father wouldn't allow it. He couldn't afford a scandal, not with his business empire hanging in the balance. So he made a deal with Helen to keep Grace hidden, and to keep you, Ethan, from ever knowing the truth." Grace's breath hitched as the weight of Sylvia's words settled in. "You're saying I'm Richard's daughter? Lily's sister?" Sylvia nodded. "Yes, and your father did everything he could to make sure neither of you ever found out." Ethan felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. Grace was his sister. His father had hidden it for years, buried the truth to protect his precious empire, and in doing so, had torn apart two lives. And now, the full scope of Richard's betrayal was finally coming to light. But as Sylvia's words sank in, Ethan realized there was still one question left unanswered. "What happened to Lily?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Sylvia's expression hardened. "That is something you'll have to ask your father. He's the only one who knows the full truth." The air in Sylvia Monroe's sitting room felt heavy, oppressive, as if the truth she had just revealed was too large for the space to contain. Ethan and Grace sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of her confession. Grace, his sister. His mind swirled with the revelation. All these years of searching for answers about Lily, and now, out of the chaos, another sibling had been thrust into his life, one he never knew existed. Sylvia's calm gaze shifted between them, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her demeanor, though poised, carried the weight of someone who had been burdened with secrets for too long. "So, what now?" Grace's voice broke the silence. Her tone was calm, but her eyes were wide, filled with uncertainty. You've told us who I am, but you haven't told us why. Why was this all necessary? Sylvia sighed deeply, folding her hands in her lap. Because, Grace, your father is a man who built his empire on lies. His power, his influence, it's all constructed on the illusion of control. When Helen became pregnant with you, Richard was in the midst of expanding his business. He couldn't afford any scandals, and your existence threatened everything he had worked for. So, he made sure to keep you hidden. Grace leaned forward, her face pale. Hidden from whom? What was he so afraid of? From the world, Sylvia replied softly. But more importantly, from Ethan. He was afraid that if you and Ethan grew up together, if you shared the bond that siblings are meant to have, it would be impossible to control the narrative. It would be impossible to keep the secret buried. Ethan clenched his fists, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. His father's betrayal was worse than he had ever imagined. So, my father let Lily disappear to keep his secret safe? His voice was sharp, demanding answers. Was that it? Was that why she vanished? Sylvia's expression hardened. Lily didn't disappear because of Grace, she said, her voice low and guarded. What happened to Lily was more complicated. Grace's gaze narrowed. Complicated how? Sylvia hesitated for a moment, as though weighing how much more of the truth to reveal. Lily found out about you, Grace, she said finally. She found out that you were her sister, and that Richard had been keeping you a secret. She wanted to tell you, wanted to confront him about it. But your father couldn't allow that. He couldn't afford the scandal, the risk. So, he did everything he could to stop her. Ethan felt his blood run cold. Stop her? What are you saying, Sylvia? Did my father have something to do with Lily's disappearance? Sylvia's eyes flicked downward, her silence stretching into an answer of its own. She didn't need to say the words for Ethan to understand. His father had been involved. He had orchestrated everything. You need to talk to Richard, Sylvia said quietly. He's the only one who knows exactly what happened to Lily. But I warn you, Ethan, whatever you think you're going to hear, it's worse than you can imagine. Grace's face drained of color. What did he do to her? Sylvia's gaze remained downcast, her lips pressed into a thin line. I don't know everything. I only know that after Lily discovered the truth about you, she confronted your father. There was a fight. Things escalated. And then, she was gone. Ethan shot to his feet, his fists clenched in fury. The betrayal, the lies. It was all too much. He's been lying to me my whole life, Ethan growled, pacing the room. He's lied about Lily, about Grace, about everything. I trusted him. Grace stood as well, her voice shaking. I grew up believing my life was normal, thinking my mother was just protecting me from some distant past. And all this time, I was part of a family I didn't even know existed. How could he do this? Sylvia rose, her composure still intact despite the tension in the room. Your father is a man who values control above all else, she said. He wanted to control the narrative, to control his legacy. But people like Richard, men who thrive on power, they don't care about the damage they leave behind, as long as they get what they want. Ethan could barely contain his rage. I'm going to confront him, he said, his voice cold and determined. He needs to answer for what he's done. For Lily. For Grace. For all the lies. Grace hesitated, fear flickering across her face. What if he denies everything? What if he refuses to tell us the truth? Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with a grim certainty. He can't deny it anymore. We have the letters, the photographs, everything. He'll have to face it, whether he likes it or not. Sylvia nodded, watching them closely. Be careful, Ethan, she said quietly. Your father won't go down without a fight. Men like Richard, they always have a way out. Hours later, Ethan and Grace stood outside the Ross estate, their hearts pounding with a mix of dread and determination. The sprawling mansion loomed before them, a symbol of everything they had lost and everything they were about to confront. Ethan could feel the tension radiating off Grace as they approached the front door, but there was no turning back now. They were too deep into the truth to walk away. The door was opened by one of the house staff, and within moments, They were standing in the grand foyer, facing Richard Ross himself. His father was seated in the large leather armchair near the fireplace, looking every bit the powerful, untouchable businessman he had always been. But today, Ethan saw him differently. He saw the man behind the mask, the man who had hidden so many lies, who had betrayed his own children to protect his empire. Richard looked up as they entered, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "Ethan." "Grace," he said, his voice calm. "What is this about?" Ethan stepped forward, his anger barely contained. "It's about Lily and Grace and the lies you've been feeding us for years." Richard's expression didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something cold, calculating. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said smoothly, "but if you've come here to accuse me of something, I suggest you think carefully." Ethan took a deep breath, refusing to be intimidated. "We know the truth, Dad. We know that Grace is my sister, Lily's sister. We know about the affair you had with Helen Adams, about how you hid Grace from me for all these years. And we know that Lily found out. She confronted you, didn't she? And then she disappeared." Richard's eyes darkened, his calm exterior beginning to crack. "You don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to us." Grace's voice cut through the room, her eyes filled with pain. "You kept me from my family, from knowing who I really was. You made sure I would never know Ethan, never know Lily. Why? Why would you do that?" Richard stood slowly, his face hardening. "Because it was necessary," he said coldly. "Your existence, both of you, would have destroyed everything. The business, the family name, everything I've built. I did what I had to do." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "What about Lily? What did you do to her?" Richard's silence was deafening, and for a moment, Ethan thought he might deny everything. But then, his father's eyes shifted, and the truth, dark and terrible, began to spill from his lips. "She came to me," Richard said slowly, his voice low. "She found out about Grace, about the affair, and she wanted to tell the world. She was angry, reckless. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. She was going to ruin everything. So you silenced her," Ethan said, his voice trembling with rage. "You made her disappear." Richard's eyes flashed with fury. "I did what I had to do," he repeated, his voice cold. "Lily was going to destroy this family. I couldn't let that happen." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "You took her away from us. You took my sister, Ethan's sister, and you hid me from him. All for what? For your empire?" Richard's face twisted with contempt. "For the family," he spat. "For everything I built. And I'd do it again if I had to." The room was thick with tension, the truth hanging between them like a dark cloud. Ethan stared at his father, his heart pounding with a mixture of fury and heartbreak. The man who had raised him, the man he had looked up to for so long, was nothing more than a liar, a manipulator who had destroyed lives to protect his own legacy. "You're a monster," Ethan said, his voice low and shaking. "And you're going to pay for what you've done." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You won't do anything, Ethan. You're my son, and you need to understand how this world works. Power isn't about truth or justice. It's about control, and I've always had control." "Not anymore," Ethan said, his voice hardening. "This ends now." Ethan's words hung in the air like a final verdict. His father, Richard Ross, stood before him, stripped of his carefully constructed facade. The truth was out now, and the weight of that truth pressed heavily on all of them. For years, Richard had controlled the narrative, but now Ethan and Grace held the reins. Grace, her hands trembling, turned to Ethan, her face pale but determined. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Ethan's eyes never left his father's face. "We take him down," he said, his voice cold with resolve. "We make sure everyone knows what he did, to Lily, to us." Richard stood tall, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "You think you can take me down? You think you can destroy everything I've built? I've survived worse than this. I've weathered scandals, lawsuits, betrayals. This won't end the way you think it will." But Ethan was no longer the naive son who had once revered his father. The anger that simmered beneath his calm exterior had crystallized into a clear purpose: to expose the man who had stolen so much from him. Maybe you're right, Ethan said slowly, taking a step toward Richard. Maybe you'll survive this. But the world will know who you really are. And that, Dad, is something you can't control. Richard's eyes flickered with something that Ethan hadn't seen before. Fear. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, on maintaining an iron grip over his empire and his family. But now, that grip was slipping, and he could feel it. Grace, still shaken, stepped forward. "What about Lily?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You never told us what really happened to her. You said there was a fight, that things got out of control. But what did you do to her? Where is she?" Richard's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of regret in his eyes, something that didn't fit with the cold, calculating man they had come to know. "Lily was a problem I couldn't solve," he said quietly. "She threatened everything, and I did what I thought was necessary. But it wasn't supposed to happen the way it did." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the words hitting him like a blow. "What do you mean?" he demanded. "Where is she?" Richard's eyes darkened. "She's gone," he said, his voice flat. "I paid someone to keep her quiet, to make her disappear for a while until I could figure out what to do. But they went too far. She didn't survive." Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan felt the room spin around him, his worst fears confirmed. Lily wasn't missing. She was dead. And his father had been responsible. "You killed her," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling with fury. "You killed your own daughter to protect your lies." Richard didn't flinch. "I didn't kill her," he said, his voice cold. "I wanted to keep her away for a while, to buy time. But the people I hired, they made a mistake. It was never supposed to go this far." Ethan's blood boiled. His father's indifference, his casual dismissal of Lily's life, was too much to bear. "A mistake?" Ethan growled, his fists clenched. "She was your daughter. And she was going to ruin everything," Richard snapped back, his voice rising with anger. "Everything I built. She didn't understand. You don't understand. Power requires sacrifice, Ethan. Sometimes, you have to make decisions that others can't. I made the choices necessary to protect this family, to protect you." Ethan's rage boiled over, and before he could stop himself, he lunged at his father. The weight of years of betrayal, lies, and pain exploded in that moment as he grabbed Richard by the collar, his face inches from his father's. "Don't you dare say you did this for me," Ethan hissed, his voice thick with emotion. "You did this for yourself. You destroyed Lily's life. You stole Grace's identity. And you think I'll stand by and let you keep pretending you're some noble protector?" Richard's expression remained cold, but for the first time, there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "You don't understand how the world works, Ethan. You never did." "I understand enough to know that you're a coward," Ethan spat, releasing his father and stepping back. His chest heaved with anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're done. I'm going to the police. I'm going to the press. Everyone will know who you are, and I'll make sure you're held accountable for what you've done." Grace, still pale and trembling, stepped forward. "We'll make sure the world knows what you did to Lily," she said, her voice soft but firm. "She deserved better. We both did." For the first time, Richard seemed shaken, his cold exterior crumbling ever so slightly. "You think the police will help you?" he sneered. "You think the press will believe you? I've covered my tracks for years. I've built alliances, bought people's silence. You don't have proof. And without proof, you have nothing." But Ethan knew better. He had spent years as his father's protege, learning the ins and outs of the business world. He knew how to navigate power and influence, and he knew that even the most powerful men had weaknesses. "I don't need proof," Ethan said, his voice calm and measured. "Your empire is built on secrets and lies. All I have to do is pull at the right thread, and everything will unravel. Your business partners, your political allies, they'll abandon you the moment your name becomes toxic. You've spent years buying loyalty, but none of it will matter when the truth comes out." Richard's face hardened. "You're making a mistake, Ethan. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have," Ethan shot back. "And this time, I'm not going to let you manipulate me. Grace stepped closer to Ethan, her hand resting on his arm. We can do this together, she said softly, looking up at him. For Lily. Ethan nodded, his resolve firm. For Lily, he echoed. Richard's gaze flickered between them, his jaw tightening as he realized he had lost control of the situation. For the first time, he looked uncertain, as though the fortress he had spent years building around himself was finally crumbling. You'll regret this, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Both of you. No, Ethan replied, his voice steady. You're the one who will regret it. The next morning, Ethan and Grace sat in the office of Detective Sarah Monroe, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for pursuing justice, no matter how powerful her target. She listened intently as they recounted everything. Richard's confession, the letters from Helen, the photos, the lies that had torn their family apart. I knew your father was involved in shady dealings, Detective Monroe said as she looked through the evidence they had brought. But I didn't realize it went this deep. We have enough to start an investigation, Ethan said. We just need you to take it from here. Monroe nodded. I'll make sure we do this right. But you need to know, taking down someone like Richard Ross won't be easy. He has connections, power. He'll fight this. Ethan glanced at Grace, who gave him a small, determined nod. We're ready for whatever comes, Ethan said. We just want justice for Lily. Monroe leaned back in her chair, studying them both. You're doing the right thing, she said. But this won't be over quickly. Be prepared for a long battle. Ethan nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was in control of his own fate. Not his father, not the lies that had been spun around him. He and Grace had found each other through the chaos, and now, together, they would face whatever came next. As they left the police station, Grace turned to Ethan. Do you think we'll ever really know what happened to Lily? Ethan sighed, his heart heavy with the thought. Maybe not, but we'll make sure her story is told. We'll make sure everyone knows she mattered. Grace smiled, though her eyes still held the weight of the past. Thank you, Ethan, for everything. Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. We'll get through this, he said softly, together. And as they walked down the steps of the station, side by side, they knew that the fight for justice had only just begun. Months passed after Ethan and Grace's confrontation with Richard, and the battle for justice unfolded with relentless intensity. As Detective Monroe had warned, taking down Richard Ross was not going to be easy. His wealth, connections, and influence spread deep into the city's power structures, and as the investigation began, Richard used every tool at his disposal to block, delay, and distort the truth. But Ethan and Grace were determined. Every day they worked with Monroe, digging deeper into the layers of lies and corruption that their father had built over the years. The media slowly began to catch wind of the scandal brewing behind the walls of the Ross empire. Stories of Richard's hidden affairs, questionable business dealings, and the disappearance of his daughter Lily began to surface, chipping away at his once pristine public image. For Ethan, the fight wasn't just about exposing his father's crimes. It was about reclaiming the pieces of his family that had been stolen from him. It was about honoring Lily's memory and giving her the justice she deserved. And it was about protecting Grace, his newly discovered sister, from the darkness that had nearly consumed their lives. One rainy evening, several months after the investigation had begun, Ethan found himself standing on the balcony of his penthouse, watching the city lights shimmer through the drizzle. The weight of everything he had learned, everything he had lost, pressed down on him. The revelation that Lily had been murdered at their father's command still haunted his every waking moment. The fact that Grace had been hidden from him for so many years, kept apart as a result of Richard's selfish choices, only deepened the sense of betrayal. Grace joined him on the balcony, her presence a quiet comfort. They had grown closer in the months since learning they were siblings, bonded not only by the tragedy of their shared past, but by the strength they had found in each other. How are you holding up? Grace asked softly, leaning against the railing beside him. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't know. Some days, it feels like we're making progress. Other days, it feels like we'll never get the answers we need. Grace nodded, understanding the weight of that uncertainty. I feel the same way, but we're closer than we were before. We're getting there. Ethan glanced over at her, grateful for her resilience. You've been stronger than I ever imagined. I don't know how you've kept it together through all of this. Grace smiled faintly, though there was sadness in her eyes. I guess I didn't have a choice. We lost Lily. We lost so much because of him. I just want to make sure we don't lose each other, too. We won't, Ethan said firmly. We're in this together. Just then, his phone buzzed, pulling him back to the present. It was a call from Detective Monroe. Ethan, Monroe said as soon as he answered. We've got him. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? We've arrested your father, Monroe explained, her voice steady. We've gathered enough evidence, between the letters, the witness statements, and the financial records we uncovered. We've connected him to Lily's disappearance and death. He's being charged with manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. It's over. Ethan felt a wave of emotion crash over him. Relief, disbelief, and grief all at once. So that's it? He asked, his voice thick. It's really happening? It's really happening, Monroe confirmed. We'll proceed with the trial soon, but for now, he's in custody. I just thought you'd want to know. Ethan thanked her and hung up, his hand trembling as he lowered the phone. He turned to Grace, who had been watching him with anxious eyes. What is it? She asked, her voice tense. It's over, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. They've arrested him. Grace's eyes widened, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, she let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging with the weight of the news. We did it, she whispered. We really did it. Ethan nodded, his own emotions swirling. The man who had controlled their lives for so long was finally being held accountable. But with that victory came a deep, aching sadness. Justice for Lily didn't bring her back. It didn't undo the years of pain and loss. But it was something, an acknowledgement that her life had mattered, that her death wouldn't go unpunished. The trial was a media sensation. For weeks, the courtroom was filled with reporters, onlookers, and lawyers as the details of Richard Ross's crimes were laid bare. Witnesses testified about the secret deals, the bribes, and the lengths to which Richard had gone to maintain his power. The letters from Helen Adams proved pivotal, as did the financial records showing the hush money paid to keep Grace hidden from the family. The prosecution painted Richard as a man who had sacrificed his own children to protect his empire, a man who had orchestrated Lily's disappearance when she threatened to expose the truth. The defense, of course, attempted to portray Richard as a man driven by love for his family, a man who had made difficult choices to protect his legacy. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Richard's attempts to control the narrative unraveled with every passing day. In the end, Richard was found guilty on all charges. The verdict was a relief, but it wasn't a celebration. Ethan and Grace had won the battle, but the war had left them scarred. Several weeks after the trial, Ethan and Grace stood together at a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of the city. A simple headstone marked the place where Lily's remains had finally been laid to rest, after years of being hidden away by their father's schemes. It had taken time, but they had finally found her. Ethan placed a single white rose on the grave, his heart heavy with emotion. He thought about all the years they had lost, all the moments that had been stolen from them. Lily had been more than just his sister. She had been his light, his best friend, the person who had always seen the good in him, even when he couldn't see it in himself. I wish you were here, Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. I wish you could see how much you mattered to us. Grace knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on the grave. She knows, she said softly. Wherever she is, she knows. They stood in silence for a while, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The journey to this point had been long and painful, but now, at least, they had some measure of peace. We're going to be okay, Grace said after a while, her voice steady. We're going to rebuild, one step at a time. Ethan nodded, looking at her with gratitude. We are. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of closure. The truth had been revealed, justice had been served, and though the scars would remain, he and Grace had each other. They had found a family, even through the wreckage of their father's betrayal. As they walked away from Lily's grave, side by side, Ethan knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he felt like they had the strength to face whatever came next. Together,